Okay, good morning. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month, Avram Masheni Kelman, with the hope and prayer that this Tisha B'Av will be a chag, filled with joy in the eternal base on Mikdash. Our Daf Yomi Parak sponsors, Jeffrey and Sherry Venick and Stephen and Holly Venick in memory of their father Herman Venick, Chani Yisrael ben Ruvain Zal. Herman was a beloved husband, father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and a longtime pillar of our Kehillah. May our collective learning serve as an aliyah for his neshama. The week of learning, Akiva Andrews, in honor of his wife, Dr. Karen Andrews' academic appointment as a lecturer at Hebrew University, as well as Ira Miriam Grossman in the merit of a refuah shlema for all those in need. Okay, and thank you again to Maishi for sending out the pictures, so we'll try to refer to them, although today is not as complex in those respects as the last couple of days. Says the Gemara, today is Daf Yud Aleph 11, we're going to pick up on Yud Amud Bey's second to 4 lines from the bottom. So the Mishnah said, we talked about the fact that if you had a mavui, the korah that was higher than 20 amos, you had to lower it. And we said that if it was wider than 10 amos, you had to be mamayit, you had to lessen the width of the mavui. But the Mishnah said in Yeshel Tzuras HaPesach that if there was a Tzuras HaPesach, which consists of 2 side posts and a top post, a korah, and 2 lechis, that would that afal pi sherachav me'aser and tzarich l'mayit, that even though it's wider than 10 amas, you don't need to minimize the width of the mavui if you have a tzuras HaPesach. So says the Gemara, Ashkechan tzuras HaPesach d'mahanya barachvo. So it's very clear from our Mishnah that a tzuras HaPesach helps if your mavui is too wide. V'amaltara d'mahanya begovo. And as well, we learned on Daf Gimel, amaltara, which we talked about, was maybe either something kinim, like a decorative thing on the lintel that drew attention, or maybe it was these cedar wood that had a coal that people knew about it. But whatever the point was, it drew your attention to that. So then you could have even higher than 20 amos. So the question is, so what can a tzuras HaPesach help? So we found that tzuras HaPesach helps with width, and an amaltara helps with height. Top of Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. So if chamai, what about the opposite of that? Could a tzuras HaPesach help if for a height issue, and could an amaltara help for a width issue? So it says the Gemara. We're going to answer the first question first, which is, can a tzuras HaPesach help for height? Says the Gemara, Tashma, come in here, the Sayim we learned in the Brisa, Mavi Shugavai Maser Mama, Yamayet, that if you have a Mavi that's too tall, it's more than 20 amos, you have to lower it. V'im Yesho tzuras HaPesach, if it has a tzuras HaPesach in the tzarich l'mayit, you don't need to lessen it. You don't need to make it lower. So clearly from this Brisa, that a tzuras HaPesach helps for a height issue. Says the Gemara, Amaltara berachvai mai, what about an amaltara, something that draws attention to it, can that help with a width issue if your mavi is wider than 10 amos the opening? Tashma, come in here the saying because we learned in a brisa. Mavi shugavoy me'aser mama yamayit, that if you have a mavi that's too tall, it's more than 20 amos, you have to lower it. Varach me'aser yamayit, if it's wider than 10, you have to narrow it. V'im yeshlo tzuras HaPesach and it's archlemayit, that if you have a tzuras HaPesach, you don't need to narrow it or lower it. V'im yeshlo amaltara ein tzarich l'mayit, and continues the brisa, and if it has an amaltara, you don't need to lessen it. So it says the Gemara, my lava seifa. Isn't this going on the second case, which is the case where your mavui was too wide, it was more than 10 amos wide, and it's telling you that if you have an amaltara, that you don't need to lessen the width. So and that would answer our question. So the Gemara says, no, lo aresha. That we're going on, it's going on the ratio. It's talking about when the height was too high, 20 amos, that an amaltara helped, that we already knew. So this brisa is not necessarily any proof to the point, and therefore we leave off inconclusive as to whether an amaltara would help with width. I think halacha l'maisa that is a machlokas in the Rishonim. Says the Gemara, Masnile. So we're going to turn our world a little bit upside down now from what we've always learned. Masnile Rav Yehuda l'chia bar Rav kamei de Rav. Rav Yehuda was teaching our Mishnah to Chia, the son of Rav, in front of Rav. So we said that if you have a tzuras HaPesach and it's wider than 10, you don't need, in other words, as long as you have the tzuras HaPesach, it's okay if it's wider than 10. So Amrlei, so Rav said to Rav Yehuda, Asnayet tzarich l'mayit. No, what the proper girsa in the Mishnah is to say that even with a tzuras HaPesach, you need to lessen it. So he's saying you never have more than 10 amos in a mavui. In other words, even with a tzuras HaPesach, it doesn't help. So okay, some Rav Yosef says, Midivrei Rabbeinu, once Rav told us that a tzuras HaPesach doesn't help for a challenge of 10, Nilmad, we should learn from there a different halacha, which is Chatzar Shiruv Psachim Echalonos, that if you were to have a chatzar that is filled with doorways and windows. We're talking about windows here that that are open at the 10 tefachim point. They're open. So it means so here's the issue, that if the chutzner is majority filled with doors and windows, and so the halacha is that well, we'll see what the halacha is, but that's the case where you have majority doors and windows, and obviously that creates an environment of parts merub al omed, where you have more opening, because if the majority of the area is doorways, those are open. And if you think about it, a window and a doorway is like this. It has the shape of a tzuras HaPesach. So Rav Yosef says, from the words of Rav, we should learn that if you have a chutzner that's parts merub al omed, because it's primarily comprised of doorways and windows, einoni teres with tzuras HaPesach, we should learn that it's not helped by tzuras HaPesach. My time. So in other words, how do you learn one from the other? What does one have to do with the other? Why? Because he said that a tzuras HaPesach doesn't help for a width challenge, that's going to tell you something about parts merub al omed. So the Gemara says, Hoyava yoser me eser oser b'mavoi uparetz merub al omed oser b'chatzer. So he says, we see that in other words, basically the idea is as follows, that we've talked about this many times, that if you have an area, you have a mechitza, if it has a pesach in it, then that's acceptable. And the question is, when you have certain breaches, that takes away from it being a pesach. What would be two of the breaches that we have are, one is that if it's parts merub al omed, if you have openings, and there are so many openings that there are more openings than there's wall, then that looks like a breach, even if it's less than 10 amas. So that we know is parts merub al omed. And we also know that what's another problem that could create a breach is if you have a more than 10 amma opening, so then we don't consider it a pesach, even if you have more walls than opening. But if any given opening is more than 10 amas, that's a problem. So basically what we're saying is as follows. Those are the problems of breaches that take something out of being in the category of being a pesach, of being a doorway, which is acceptable. So what Rav Yosef is trying to say, once you tell me that a tzuras HaPesach doesn't help with opening that's greater than 10, so it's not going to help with the other kind of breach either, which is going to be a case where you have parts merub al omed, even if it's less than 10 amos, right? But in other words, since there's more openings than closed, so I might have thought that a tzuras HaPesach is going to help with that. So he says, no, once you see it doesn't help by widening a doorway, it's not going to help with the other kind of breach, which is parts merub al omed, where you have more things. So therefore, said Rav Yosef, if I have a chutzner that's filled primarily or majority with windows or doorways which are open, they're not closed, and therefore you have a case of parts merub al omed, I'll tell you that a tzuras HaPesach would not help. Ma yoser me'eser ha'oser b'mavei ein inter b'tzuras HaPesach. Just like we now see from Rav, greater than 10, a width is considered a breach in the mavei, not a pesach, and it's not helped with the tzuras HaPesach. Then af parts merub al omed ha'oser b'chatzer ein inter b'tzuras HaPesach. Then so too parts merub al omed, which we've seen, does not allow, you cannot allow carrying in a chatzer if it's parts merub al omed. So that too is not going to be solved by tzuras HaPesach. Basically, he's saying once we see for one kind of breach, tzuras HaPesach doesn't help, so it doesn't help for the other kind of breach. So the Gemara says, not so fast. You cannot assume that just because there's a halacha by wider than 10, that's necessarily going to be the halacha by parts merub al omed. Why? Because says the Gemara, Mali yoser me'aser ha'oser b'mavui shekein lo hitarta bo etzo pasi biros l'Reb Meir. So, okay, one second. Let's just give a little bit of background here. So we talked yesterday about Pasei Biros. Pasei Biros were the leniency that the Rabbanan made for the Olei Regalim going up to Yerushalayim, that they would put those little L-shaped brackets around the bar so that they'd be able to draw water out of the bar up to the ground level, because the bars are Shus Yachid, the ground levels are Shus Rabbim, right? So we talked about this yesterday, that we were trying to figure out what's the upper limit of wider than 10. But in any event, we talked yesterday about the view of Rabbi Yehuda, which is you could have 13 1/3 amos, which was basically 4 animals going in and 4 animals coming out. Rabbi Meir has the opinion, we're going to see this in Mitzvah Daf Yud Zayin, I believe it's Yud Zayin, that Rabbi Meir has the opinion that it's 3 animals in and 3 animals out, and since each animal is 1 2/3 amma, so that's 10 amas wide. So the Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that by Pasei Biros, we don't allow you more than 10 amas. So now what the Gemara is going to say is as follows. You cannot learn from just because you have a halacha of tzuras HaPesach by opening of 10 amos, you cannot learn to parts murub ala omed, because we're going to say as follows. Mali yoser me'aser oser b'mavui, that when we talk about a problem of something wider than 10, sheken lo etarta ba'etzo pasi biros or Meir, according to Reb Meir, you never, even by pasi biros, where Chazal tried to be as lenient as possible to help the Olei Regalim, according to Reb Meir, they never allowed a gap of more than 10 amas, because that, according to Reb Meir, is the maximum. Tomar, will you therefore learn the parts murub ala omed ha'oser b'chatzer shekain hitarta etzel pasi biros l'divrei hakol. So he says, but how could you compare that to parts murub ala omed, where everyone, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, agree that you allow for that special leniency of parts murub ala omed, because as we discussed, pasi biros just has that little 1 amma thing on each side, and so clearly, if you have a 10 amma gap, so each wall has 10 amas of gap and 2 amas of wall. So clearly, everyone agrees that we allow parts murub ala omed, that even though there's more opening than physical structure, nonetheless we consider it a valid mechitza. We see it from pasi biros. So therefore, we're saying what you see is a leniency that we will allow parts murub ala omed according to everyone, whereas we will never allow, if you go in the version of Rebbe Meir, greater than 10 amas, because it doesn't help if it's a Tzuras HaPesach, and it doesn't help if it's by Pasi Biros. So what do you see? You see that the concern of 10 amas is more chamor, because we don't loosen it by Pasi Biros, according to Rebbe Meir, is more chamor than parts murub ala omed, because even Rebbe Meir agrees that we loosen the restrictions of parts murub ala omed in the case of pasi biros. So therefore, says the Gemara, I cannot do what Rav Yosef wanted to do. Rav Yosef said, Rav paskin something by greater than 10 amas to say Tzuras HaPesach doesn't work, and we're going to apply it to the case of parts murub ala omed to say that Tzuras HaPesach doesn't work. Says the Gemara, it doesn't work that way, because you see that everyone is mekel by parts murub ala omed, and according to Reb Meir, no one is meko by 10. So therefore, you see parts murub ala omed is less rigorous or less strict. So says the Gemara, you cannot do what Reb Yosef was saying, which is just learn out, just because Rav says a halacha by 10, to assume that that's also going to be the halacha by parts murub ala omed. Says the Gemara, let's say that the view that Tzuras HaPesach does not help. So in other words, Rav Yosef tried to prove that Tzuras HaPesach doesn't help by parts murub ala omed, right? So, but the question is, and we said there's no proof from what you said. But in other words, that's his view, Rav Yosef's view. So we said, maybe there's a support for this idea that Tzuras HaPesach does not help by parts murub ala omed. Why? Because we say, defanas halalu, these walls, shiruban psachim v'chalonos, that the majority of them are doorways and windows, which, as we said before, are obviously open space. They're parots. That defanas halalu, shiruban psachim v'chalonos, mutter. They're mutter, even though it's open space. And says the Brisa now, ubavad, so long sheyehei omed murub ala parts, as long as the physical part is greater than the open part. So says the Gemara, shiruban salkadaitach. How could that be that you can't possibly, in other words, these are inherently contradictory. What you're saying is, if it's comprised mostly of windows and doors, which means it's more parrots than omed, then it's mutter, as long as there's more omed than parrots. So it doesn't make any sense, right? So says the Gemara, ella, ema, so rather the word you should read in the beginning is sheriba bahem psachim v'chalonos, that if there are a lot of windows and doors, ubavad sheyehei omed murub ala parrots, as long as the omed is more than the parts. So what's it saying? Windows and doors have the qualification that they have, we're assuming now that they have a Tzuras HaPesach because they have sides and they have a top. And yet you see that the Mishnah says you could have a lot of them, but not more, not enough that it gets you to parts murub ala omed. So you see that even in an instance where you're employing the device of a Tzuras HaPesach, you still need omed murub ala parts. You need more physical than open. So says the Gemara, that seems to be a proof to the halacha that Rav Yosef was trying to learn from Rav, which we're not learning from Rav, but the idea that Tzuras HaPesach does not help by parts murub ala omed. So the Gemara says, Rav Kana would answer, say, no proof from there. Ki tanyahi bepischei shimoi. That's talking about when you have a pischei shimoi. Rashi says comes from either shomamin, like they're desolate, there's like destroyed, there's a door that's not properly constructed, or Rashi says psachim mekulkolin, that something that's ruined, like we say zakan ashmai is someone who's chaser mitorah, is missing Torah. But the idea is these are deficient doorways. So what does that mean? My Pischei Shimai, Pligi about Rav Chumi, Rav Yosef, that there's an argument between Rav Chumi and Rav Yosef what it means when it says Pischei Shimai, Chad Amar Delesle Shakfi, Chad Amar Delesle Tikra. One says that it has no side posts, and one said it has no top. So what does it mean to have no side posts? So that's going to be the case if you want to see it on in the pictures number 84, which is Nichnas V'Yotze. It was like a jagged edge. You had brickwork, and you pulled out certain bricks. So it's gonna look like this as you look at the wall. So therefore, it has no side posts. Alternatively, we're talking about a case where it has no tikra, it has no roof, which would be picture 85. So the idea is you have psachim and chalonos, you have windows and doors that are open, but they have no roof above them. But if they would have one, if there would be a tzuras HaPesach, then maybe in fact you would be able to have parts merubal omed. So no proof from that to this halacha. Okay, so now we're going back to Rav. Rav said that in our Mishnah we should learn that greater than 10 amos wide, a tzuras HaPesach does not help. Says the Gemara, V'af Reb Yochanan savar lo lahad Rav. Reb Yochanan agrees with that halacha of Rav that a tzuras HaPesach doesn't help for wider than 10. The Amar Ravin bar Rav Ada, Amar Rav Yitzchak, Ravin, the son of Rav Ada, said the name of Rav Yitzchak, that you had a story with a certain person who came from this valley called Beis Chorson, that he stuck 4 poles in the 4 corners of a field. He draped a vine on them. So that's a picture in number 86. The story came in front of the Chachamim and said, "Is this a valid thing?" And they said, for purposes of klayim, which, as we know, klayim you cannot plant in a vineyard, you cannot plant other plantings. So we said as follows, that we know that if there is a physical wall, that you can plant up to the wall. So they said, even if what you have is a halachic wall, this is the nature of halacha. Halacha looks at it as if, halachically, as if there's a physical wall. So therefore, as long as you have this vine going around these poles, which creates halachic mechitza, so then you can within the poles you can plant a vineyard, and right outside the poles you could plant the grain. It's not a problem. V'amar Reish Lakish. So that was the basic halacha that the Chachamim said you could use it for klayim, and Reish Lakish said kederech she'atir lo le'inyan klayim, kach atir lo le'inyan Shabbos. So too, look, mechitza is a mechitza. If you're allowed to use this tzuras HaPesach, because obviously the poles, each 2 poles and the vine above it is a tzuras HaPesach. So Reish Lakish says if it's good for klayim, it's good for Shabbos. Rabbi Yochanan says leklayim atir lo, that for klayim they said it's okay, le'inyan Shabbos lo atir lo, but for Shabbos they did not allow it. So it says, all right. So now we're gonna say, b'mayaskina. What are we talking about? Ilema minatzad. If you're going to tell me that this is a case where this is picture 87, where the vine was going around, it was not on the tops of the pole, it was around the sides of the pole. So that can't be, because V'hamar Rav Chisda said tzuras HaPesach shasam minatzad lo asav lo klum, that if you created a tzuras HaPesach from the side, meaning that the zmur did not go on top of the pole, that's nothing. So Ella Agaban, so we must be talking about a case where in fact the string or the vine in this case went on the tops of the poles, and we're going to say Ubamai. Okay, so we know it's going on top of the poles. Ubamai. What's the scenario about the size of this enclosure that was made? Ilema be'eser. If you're going to tell me that we're talking about 10 amos or less, B'hal lemer Reb Yochanan b'Shabbos lo. Would Reb Yochanan say that for Shabbos purposes, a tzuras HaPesach of less than 10 is not a valid tzuras HaPesach, is not a valid mechitza? Of course he would agree it's a valid mechitza. So it can't be talking about that because Reb Yochanan said that it doesn't work for Shabbos. So elalav, b'yeser me'aser. So it must be talking about, so we've now established, it must be talking about a scenario where the space between the poles was more than 10 amos. And the wire, or in this case the vine, went on tops of the poles. So what do you have? You have a valid case of 4 tzuras HaPesach, because you have 4 poles and you have the 4 sides. You have 4 tzuras HaPesach. You have greater than 10 amos between them. And what is Rabbi Yochanan Paskin? Rabbi Yochanan Paskins, it does not work for Shabbos. It only works for Klayim. So you see, like Rav, who said that a Tzuras HaPesach does not help for greater than 10, Rav Yochanan is saying the same thing, because he's saying this is not a valid Shabbos Mechitza, because it's presumably because it's wider than 10, even though it has a Tzuras HaPesach. So that seems to be saying Rav Yochanan holds like Rav that Tzuras HaPesach does not help on Shabbos for wider than 10. So the Gemara says, "Lo, this is the scenario. A lot of we think so, but no. La'olam be'eser. Really, we're talking about it's 10 amos or less. Uminat tzad. So before we said, well, if it's on top, it can't possibly be talking about 10, because why would Rabbi Yochanan not allow that for Shabbos? So now we're saying it is talking about less than 10, and the reason it's going to be a machlokas, and Rabbi Yochanan is going to say not for Shabbos, is because we're dealing with a case where the vine goes around the sides of the poles, it's not on the tops of the poles. Now we asked before, wait a second, how could he say that? Rav Chisda said lo asav lo klum, it's no good. So how could Rabbi Yochanan paskin that, how could Reish Lakish paskin would be good for Shabbos? So it must be that it was not on the side. So now the Gemara is going to say, no, that's the very point. This thing that Rav Chisda said, lo asav lo klum, is exactly what they're arguing about. So we are dealing with the side, and we assumed for sure everyone would agree that if it's on the side it doesn't help. But we're saying, no, that's the machlokas. Lo olam ba'aser, we're talking about 10 or less amos, uminat tzad, and it's the vine went around the sides of the poles. Uv the Rav Chisda kamiflagi, and they're arguing about Rav Chisda. So Reish Lakish, who said that you could carry both for Shabbos and Klayim, holds that even from the side it works. And Rav Yochanan, who says that it works for Klayim but not for Shabbos, would be talking about if because it's from the side, but he would not say if it's on top. So therefore, what's it coming out? That according to the way we're establishing it, Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish are arguing about an issue of when you have the zmura, the branch or the wire is on the side. That's the case they're arguing about, but we don't see. That's not a valid Tzuras HaPesach in the traditional sense. So therefore, we don't see any proof that he holds like Rav that it's Tzuras HaPesach on Shabbos, if properly constructed with two poles on the side and it's something going across the tops. We have no proof of that. So it's actually an interesting thing. It comes out that there's different levels of Tzuras HaPesach. So for Klayim, you could have even from the side. For Shabbos, you need above it. And so these are separate things. So it's an interesting thing. People talk a lot about a chuppah needs Tzuras HaPesach. So how you construct a chuppah is interesting. They talk about this. But the very interesting question comes up. If you have a Tzuras HaPesach that's a valid door, that's a valid mechitza. So one of the things they talk about is, let's say you have a minyan and there's a Tzuras HaPesach between them. Is that a problem? Some people say not. But the interesting question would be the following. If it's a Tzuras HaPesach, then you should need a mezuzah. And yet, we don't have mezuzahs by Tzuras HaPesach. Most Eruvim rely on Tzuras HaPesach. So they say, okay, you have different levels. Klayim, even from the side. For Erev and Shabbos, it's enough to have Tzuras HaPesach. To have a mezuzah, the doorway that you need a mezuzah, that's an even higher level. So we don't have it by this kind of Tzuras HaPesach. The Chazon Ish says not like that. He says, no, a Tzuras HaPesach is a Tzuras HaPesach. So he says, so what about the fact people bring a proof that all these cities with mechitzas, with Tzuras HaPesach, which we rely on for Erev, no one puts up a mezuzah. He says, okay, that could be because, if you're going to stick it out, it's not safe for the mezuzah. People could take it down. Or if it's an ear that's a majority, that it's mixed, both Jews and non-Jews, so maybe it doesn't get a mezuzah for those hilchos mezuzah reasons. But according to him, from a halachic perspective, Tzuras HaPesach is Tzuras HaPesach. So people say that if, let's say, you had a Jewish neighborhood, that it was comprised entirely of Jews. You have some of those in Eretz Yisrael, and it would be a safe area that some would say that if you make your Erev with Tzuras HaPesach, you have to put up a mezuzah by each one. In any event, okay, so what we've said is that there's no proof that Rabbi Yochanan is actually talking about the regular case of a properly constructed Tzuras HaPesach. When he said it didn't work for Shabbos, was talking about one that was Minat Tzad. The Gemara is now going to ask a seeming stira between Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish, and with this, it's going to try to establish that Rav Yochanan actually is saying as halacha is talking about on the top, not on the side. So let's see. So the Gemara says, because we're going to have a question, because we just brought a machlokas before where Reish Lakish said that this Tzuras HaPesach that he made with the vine helps for Kalayim but not for Shabbos. I'm sorry, Reish Lakish said it helps for both, and Rabbi Yochanan says it helps for Klayim, but not for Shabbos. Now we're going to bring another brisa. We're going to bring another statement. Amar Reish Lakish says Mishum Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Chanina. The Reish Lakish, pay attention to that. He said in the name of his Rabbi Yehuda ben Chanina, Amar Beis, he says as follows: Peah, that if you have Rashi says this is it's a different term because it's a twined branch or vine. Same kind of case. He had four poles and he put it on. So we say Peah muteres l'inyan Klayim avalo l'Shabbos. That it's so now you have Reish Lakish, who before said it works for both Shabbos and Klayim, is saying now it only works for Klayim but not for Shabbos. Rabbi Yochanan says ki mechitzas l'Shabbos delo kach mechitzas l'Klayim delo. And then Rabbi Yochanan says, in this case, just like by Shabbos it doesn't work, it also doesn't work by Klayim. So what do you have? You have a second brisa, you have a second memra of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, where they each seem to take it up a notch and reduce the allowance. So Reish Lakish, who used to allow both Shabbos and Klayim, now says only Klayim, and Rabbi Yochanan, who says Klayim but not Shabbos, now says neither. So we have a stira. So the Gemara says, Bishlam ad Reish Lakish ad Reish Lakish kasha. So I can answer up the part of Reish Lakish because hadidei hadarabe. Because the first thing we said, Reish Lakish said it in his own name. So when he said it's good for both Shabbos and Klayim, that was his own name. And the second statement, which he said in the name of his Rebbe, which was Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Chanina. So we're going to say, okay, so that's how you explain the stira in Reish Lakish's opinion, because once he's stating his own opinion, once he's stating the opinion of his Rebbe. Ela de Rabbi Yochanan kasha. But Rabbi Yochanan is a kasha because Rabbi Yochanan in both instances said it in his own name. And in the first instance, he said when you have this branch slung over the poles, that in one case he says it works for Klayim and not for Shabbos, and in one case he says it works for neither. So how do you answer this? So the Gemara says, so I could come up with something that would explain the distinction. Maybe that what Rabbi Yochanan was saying was, by minatzad, if it's on the tzad, so then it only works, it doesn't work for anything. It doesn't work for Shabbos, it doesn't work for Klayim. If it's on top, for Klayim, but not for Shabbos, so that would explain, right? But then what we have, if that's in fact, if we're dealing with the first brisa, where he says it works for Klayim and not for Shabbos, would be dealing with where the vine goes on the top of the poles, so then that would be a validly constructed Suras HaPesach, and that would restore the proof that Rabbi Yochanan holds like Rav, that Suras HaPesach does not help for wider than 10 amas. So that's what the Gemara is saying. We should still be able to, in other words, you tried to answer that it was minatzad, and that's why they're not talking about a validly constructed Suras HaPesach, but we proved, or we're trying to prove, that because there's a stira in Rabbi Yochanan, and the only way we know how to answer it right now is to say that the one where he permits it for Klayim and not for Shabbos must be talking when it's on top, and where it's minatzad, he says nothing works, so that would seem to restore the proof that Rabbi Yochanan holds like Rav. So the Gemara says, continues in its question, but if you're going to say idi v'idi minatzad, then you're going to say that the first brisa was also talking about from the side, which was the answer we gave why it wasn't a proof that Rabbi Yochanan holds like Rav. Then how are you going to explain the stira in Rabbi Yochanan's halachos? So it seems to restore the proof that he holds like Rav. So the Gemara says, La'olam, really I'll tell you, in fact, idi v'idi minatzad, that there is, again, I'm gonna say that there's no proof that Rabbi Yochanan holds like Rav as it relates to Hilchos Shabbos, because they're both talking about something minatzad. So then the question will be, okay, well, why in one case does he say it doesn't work for Shabbos or Klayim, and in another case he says it works for Klayim but not for Shabbos? What's the difference? So the Gemara says, Hasam ba'eser, hacha b'yoser me'eser. So he says, when Rabbi Yochanan said that it works for Klayim and not for Shabbos, was talking about where it was 10 amas or less. But where it's greater than 10 amas, so then he would say it doesn't work for Shabbos or Klayim. So again, we're back to a point that Rabbi Yochanan is not discussing a properly constructed Suras HaPesach at all. So he has no proof what Rabbi Yochanan holds vis-a-vis Rav's halacha that Suras HaPesach on Shabbos does not help for wider than 10. But rather, what are we seeing in the two psakim of Rabbi Yochanan? He says in either case it doesn't work for Shabbos, but for Klayim will depend on whether it's 10 amas or less, or it's more than 10 amas. If it's 10 amas or less, then even a weak, a poor form of Suras HaPesach, where the wire is on the side, will still work for Klayim. But if it's greater than 10 amos, then even kloyim, which allows for a deficient or less than ideal tzuras HaPesach, will not allow that, and it's not going to work either for Shabbos or for kloyim. That's how we resolve the stira in Rabbi Yochanan. So now, says the Gemara, just where do we get this idea that it should make a difference whether it's more or less than 10 as relates to kloyim? So minat temer deshani lam ben eser liyoser me'eser. So where do I have this idea that by kloyim there's a distinction between whether it's 10 amos or less or it's more than 10? Da'amalei Rav Yochanan l'Reish Lakish, because Rav Yochanan said to Reish Lakish, lo kacha yemaisa hamaisa wasn't the story. Shahalach Rav Yeshua etzar Rav Yochanan ben Nuri lomod Torah, that Rav Yeshua went to Rav Yochanan ben Nuri to learn. Afal pishabaki behilchas kloyim. That it's a beautiful thing that Rav Yeshua went to Rav Yochanan ben Nuri, even though he was a baki on his own in Hilchas Klayim, but nonetheless, in Matzah, he found Rav Yochanan ben Nuri, Sheyoshe ben Ilanos, that he was sitting between the trees. Umasach. So what happened? So Rav Yeshua found him between the trees, and he said, very convenient that we're between the trees, because I want to ask you a question, and I'll demonstrate what I'm talking about. So Rav Yeshua, Masach Zmur me'ilan le'ilan. So he erected a vine going from tree to tree. So essentially, he created a tzuras HaPesach. V'amar lo, and he said, Rabbi, he said to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, Rabbi, igefanim kan mahal izroya kan. So he put up this wire between the trees, and he said to him, Rabbi, I'm standing on this side. If I were to plant a vineyard here, could I make a grain field right next door on the other side of this branch that I put up? So he asked him this question, Amar lo, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said back to him, Be'eser mutter, be'yosem me'eser aser, that if it's 10 or less, it's mutter. If it's more than 10, it doesn't work. So says the Gemara, B'may askinan. What are we talking about? Ilei ma'al gabon. If it's on top, yosem me'eser aser. Could you say that? And if you're saying the brises are talking about where it's on top, and it's telling, and I'm sorry, that Rav Yochanan ben Nuri is talking about where it's on top, and it's telling you that more than 10 width, it's usher to carry. Usher for kloyim if you have a tzuras HaPesach. V'atanya, but we learned in a brisa, hayasham kanim hadukranim v'asalam peah milmala. If you had poles that are stuck in, this is just it's a different shaped pole that comes to a sharper edge, so you could stick it in the ground more easily. But in any event, it's a pole. You stuck it in, and you made a peah milmala, which was this twisted vine. Afilu beyoser me'aser mutter. Even more than 10 is mutter. So the brisa tells you that by kloyim, more than 10, as long as it's al gabon, works. So when Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said more than 10 doesn't work, cannot be talking about al gabon. El alav min atzad. So it must be that when Rabbi Yeshua strung up this vine and showed it to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, it was where it was min atzad, where the branch did not go over the tree or over the branch, but rather went on the side. The Ka'amrle, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri answered him, Be'eser mutter yosem be'eser aser, that if it's 10 or less, it's mutter, and if it's more than 10, it's aser. So we were looking for a source. Where do we get this idea by klayim that there's a distinction between 10 or more than 10? We said we see it from this story with Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. So the Gemara says, Shema Minah, in fact, learn from there. So again, we are dealing with the fact that if you have by klayim, if you have the wire from the side, so then it depends. If it's 10 or less, it's okay. If it's more than 10, it's not okay. By klayim, if it's a properly constructed tzuras HaPesach, we saw from the brisa, as long as the wire goes on top, the branch goes on, the vine goes on top of the branch, so then we're going to say even more than 10 works by klayim, but not necessarily is that the same by Shabbos. We don't know by Shabbos. In other words, we said we have no proof that they were arguing by Shabbos. If it would be a properly constructed tzuras HaPesach, what would be the halacha? Presumably Rav would say it doesn't work, just like he says in our Mishnah, but we don't know whether Rabbi Yochanan says like Rav. Okay, says the Gemara, Gufa Amr Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says, tzuras HaPesach shasam min atzad lo asav lo klum. So we learned that before. Rav Chisda says, by Shabbos, if you put up a tzuras HaPesach from the side, it doesn't help. So this, by the way, is very nogeh halacha l'maisa, because what happens in our Eruvim, we by and large rely on telephone poles. Now, a telephone pole is a case where the pole goes up and the wires are strung along the side of it. So if you could rely on a tzuras HaPesach min atzad, we would have to really do very little to create Eruvin because the telephone wires are good. But the problem is you're not allowed to have them outside. So what do? What we do is, you see on the sides of the utility poles, they get permission to put a strip, and that strip serves as a lechi. And we're going to see in a minute, the lechi doesn't have to be connected. You have good asik, it goes up, and therefore they place that lechi, line it up so that it's beneath the wire that's going on the side. So you have the wire on the side, you have the pole, you have the wire on the side, so they put the lechi right here where it's beneath the wire. And that's because it's not good. It's not good if it's minatzad. If it would be minatzad, we wouldn't have to put that lechi on the pole at all. We could just rely on the wires as they're constructed. But in any event, says the Gemara, this tzuras HaPesach that we said, so basically what we're saying here is the concept of a tzuras HaPesach is it's as if it's a doorway. So we say you don't need an actual door, but it has to be a reasonable doorway, so therefore it needs to be strong enough that you could theoretically put a doorway up. And the Gemara says even a door made out of like a shaft or a straw, that would be fine. But in ours, halachically, we want it to be something that's capable of having a door. Rav Shlakish says the name of Rav Yanai, Tzuras HaPesach tzricha heker tzir. It needs to, you have to have like some kind of like a hinge there. So my heker tzir, what kind of hinge would you need? Rav Avia avkasa. That avkasa is we have this in Be'er. We talk about this a little bit. It's a door that's on like a pivot hinge. So you have a little thing that comes out on the bottom and comes out on the top, and the door swings on that kind of hinge. So Ashkechina Rav Acha breder Rav Avia letalmidei de Rav Ashi. So Rav Acha, the son of Rav Avia is the one who said you need this pivot hinge. Met the Talmidim Rav Ashi. Amar Lu, he said to them, Amar Mar Midi b'Tzuras HaPesach. Did Rav Ashi say anything about Tzuras HaPesach? Amar Le, Lo Amar V'Lo Klum. He didn't say anything. So the way the Ritva, the Rashba, the Rush, they learned that he was really responding to him and saying, Rav Ashi did not paskin like your father because he didn't say that halacha. So in fact, halacha l'maisa, we don't require a hinge on a Tzuras HaPesach. Tana says the Brisa, Tzuras HaPesach she'amr, the Tzuras HaPesach that we're talking about, kana al gabeim. It's one stick on this side, one stick on that side, and a kana on top. Basically, two lechis and a korah, if you want to think in Eruvin kind of terms. So ask the Gemara, tzrichin liga or ain't tzrichin liga? Do the poles on the bottom need to touch the korah that goes across on the top? Now, I already gave you the answer to this because I mentioned that with the telephone poles, we just put up a lechi. As long as it's 10 tfachim, it doesn't have to go all the way up the side of the telephone pole. But anyway, we'll see. So Rav Nachman says, "Ein tzrichin liga." They don't need a touch. Rav Sheshes Amar tzrichin liga. They do need a touch. So Azor Rav Nachman, v'avaduv the Reish Galusa kishmaitze. So Rav Nachman said they don't need a touch. He was setting up the eruv for the Reish Galusa, who was the head politician, Jewish politician in Bavel, and so therefore he set it up where he had poles that went up to a certain point, but then the wires that were going across them were not touching. So Amalei Rav Sheshes Shame, so Rav Sheshes, who held that they need to touch, said to his servant Rav Gada, he said to Rav Gada, Zil Shlov Shadinu, go take them off and throw them down. I think that's an invalid eruv that Rav Nachman set up for the Reish Galusa, so knock it down. Azal Shalov Shadinu. So he went, he listened to his Rebbe, he took it down, and he took them off and threw them down. Ashkechinu the Reish Galusa Chavshu. So the Reish Galusa's people said, "What are you doing?" And they arrested him. And they say, they arrested Rav Gada. Azal Rav Sheshes come above. Rav Sheshes went and he stood by the door. Amalei Gada pukta, come out. Nafik for Asa, he came out because once the Reish Galusa people saw that he was acting on the direction of Rav Sheshes, they let him out of jail. Ashkechet Rav Sheshes l'Rabbi Bar Shmuel. So Rav Sheshes, who's the one who said they need a touch, met Rabbi Bar Shmuel. Amalei Tani Mar Midi b'Tzuras HaPesach. Did you learn anything interesting about Tzuras HaPesach? Amalei in. He says yes. Tanina, we learned in a Mishnah. Kippah Remeir Mechavim Zuz v'Chacham Poter. So we say as follows: that if you have a kippah, kippah is a rounded thing, but here we're talking about an arch. And the question is as follows: that we'll see exactly what they're arguing about. Reb Meir says a kippah needs a mezuzah, and Chacham say you don't. Everyone agrees that if there's, let's just make it easy, there's machlokas rishonim in this, but let's just say that there's 10 tfachim of straight doorway before you start the arch, then everyone agrees, Amar Abaya, Hakol Modim Im Gavoa Asara, that if it's 10 tall, that they agree that if there's 10 tfachim of side post that goes straight up, even though it then goes to an archway, that's going to be a doorway. Now the question is, where though is an arch doesn't count as a lintel, as a korah? So where is the korah for this? So the way the girsa we have in Rashi would learn that the korah is the top of the wall. So what do you have? You have an arch, and it has 10 tefachim going up, and then above the arch is a flat thing. So what do you see? You see that the 10 tefachim going up are not the side walls, before they curve like this, are not connected to the top. And yet we're saying that it's a valid doorway and it requires, that everyone agrees that it requires a mezuzah. So you see, not like Reb Sheshes. Okay, keep that in mind because that's going to be the end of the Gemara. Amar Baya, Hakol Modim, everyone agrees, Im Gavoa Asara of Im B'Raglea Shlosha. Let's say you have an opening that's 10 tall, but it does not have 3 tfachim before the curve starts. So then we say that that's nothing, because Rashi explains something that's within 3 tefachim of the floor is considered like the floor. So it means once you knock out the bottom 3 tefachim, there is no straight portion of this doorway. So it's for sure not a doorway that needs a mezuzah. Inami yesh b'Raglea shlosha. Alternatively, there is more than 3 straight tefachim on the sides of the door. Ve'en gavoa asara, but it's a very short doorway, and with the arch, it's not even as high as 10 tefachim. That's nothing. So in other words, if it does not have 10 tefachim of height even, or it does not have 4 tefachim wide for at least 3 tefachim or more, it's for sure not a valid door. Keep pligi, when the Remeir and the Chum argue, b'yesh b'Raglea gimel, v'gavoya asara, ve'en rechava arba. So what happens, where you have at least 3 tefachim, where it is 4 tefachim wide, meaning 3 tefachim coming up from the floor is at least 4 tefachim wide. You do have the doorway is at least 10 tefachim, but the issue is, once you get above 3 tefachim on the side, the arch starts, and it's no longer a straight side of the door. So we say as follows, but there's enough, this arched doorway is in a broader doorway that you could theoretically, it's not just a standalone arch, it's in a broader doorway that you could cut out part of the doorway. So the idea would be, Reb Meir says we imagine, since we could cut out a rectangular doorway properly, so we're going to say therefore we're going to treat it as a proper doorway that's Mechayv Mezuzah. The Rabbanan hold, we don't do that. At the end of the day, you have a mezuzah, you have a doorway that does not have 10 tefachim going up straight, or 10 tefachim before the curve starts, so it's no good. Amrlei, so Reb Sheshes heard this from him, that basically a proof that the sides don't need to connect to the top. So he said, if the Reish Galusas people find you, don't tell them this business about the kippah, because it shows that I was wrong, and that I shouldn't have taken him out of jail. Okay, says the Mishnah, that if you have a mavoi with 3 closed sides and you have an opening to the Rosh Hashanah, what do you need? You need a lechi and a korah. Beis Hillel says, o lechi o korah, either one, which is how we learned our Mishnah. Rabbi Elazar Omer lechiayin, that you need 2 lechis on either side of a mavoi, you need it to fix it. Mishum Rabbi Yishmael Omer Talmud Echad Lifnei Rabbi Akiva, in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, there was one Talmud in front of Rabbi Akiva who said as follows, that everyone agrees, even Beis Shammai agrees with Beis Hillel, that a lechi or a korah is sufficient if the opening is less than 4 amas. That between 4 and 10, because even Beis Hillel agrees that once you get past 10, a lechi or korah doesn't work. You need a tzuras pesach. So from 4 to 10 is where Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argue. Beis Shammai and lechi v'korah. Beis Shammai says you need both a lechi and a korah. Beis Hillel and Beis Hillel says o lechi o korah, you need either or. Rabbi Akiva al zeh nechleku, that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argue even from 0 to 4 as well as 4 to 10, meaning in all cases of mavoi, Beis Shammai say you need lechi and korah, and Beis Hillel says you need one or the other. Says the Gemara, Kiman, because if you remember, we learned the halacha that talks about putting up lechi and korah, and Tanakama said you need a tzuras haPesach and a lechi or korah, and Beis Hillel, Chananya in the name of Beis Hillel said you need, Chananya in the name of Beis Hillel said you need a delas and a lechi or korah on the other end. So he said, what's our mission talking about? They said you need either a lechi or kara, both a lechi and a kara. What happened to the need for tzuras HaPesach or a delas? Rav Yehuda Hachi Kamar, Hechsher Mavai Sasam Ketzad. What's a Mavai Sasam? Because that halacha that we said that you need a tzuras HaPesach and a lechi and kara, or you need a delis and a lechi and kara, was talking about a mavoi mefulish that opened on two ends to Rishus Harabim. But here we're talking about a mavoi sasam where you have three closed walls and the fourth open to Rishus Harabim. Beis Shammai Amar lechi v'kara. Beis Shammai says you need both a lechi and a kara. Beis Hillel Amar. Beis Hillel says o lechi o kara, that you need one or the other. Beis Shammai Amar lechi v'kara, says the Gemara lemeimra the kasavi Beis Shammai arba mechitzas deraisa. So the Gemara says, wait a second. If Beis Shammai, it's one thing if you say you just need a lechi or a kara. So all you need is you need a heker, you need something to so that people don't mix it up. But once Beis Shammai is saying it's not enough to have a lechi or a kara, you have to have both. It seems that he's trying to craft a mechitza. So maybe Beis Shammai, it wouldn't be a full wall, but it's kind of like sukkah. You have two walls and then a little wall. Maybe he holds you need to build something for the fourth wall because midaraisa, in order to have a mechitza, in order to have a rishus yachid, you need four sides that have a mechitza. Because otherwise, why is Beis Shammai making you build something? So meaning both a lechi and a kara. So the Gemara says, so he says, even Beis Shammai agrees that three walls midaraisa is enough. Why does he make you build something? Because they hold derabanan, they wanted you to have a fourth wall. Not just a heker of either a lechi or kara, wanted you to build a little bit of a mechitza, so you have a lechi and a kara. Beis Hillel amrim o lechi o kara, either or. So it says the Gemara, lema kasavi Beis Hillel, shalosh mechitzas deraisa. So Beis Hillel says you could put a lechi or a kara only for the fourth wall. So maybe should we establish from there that since they hold you need three full walls, otherwise that he does not hold the two walls is enough. If you remember, we had this with Rabbi Yehuda with the overpass, and he said Yasser al Kain that if you put up lechis, that even if the two walls on the sides of the Rishus Rabbim were there, Rabbi Yehuda was of the opinion that that's a Rishus Yachid D'Oraisa. So should we say that Beis Hillel, who says you can only fix the fourth wall with a lechi or kara, but not the third wall, holds that Midoraisa you need three walls? So the Gemara says, Lo lizark mishtayim hu d'mechayev l'taltal de'eka shalosh, that to throw something in, that meaning a Rishus D'Oraisa really only needs two walls. So if you would throw into something with two walls, you would be chayev for Hilchas Shabbos. But in order to carry, the Rabbanan said that you need three walls, and then the fourth wall just needs a lechi or kara as a heker. But that would be, they would not necessarily disagree that two walls is enough for Rishus Yachid D'Oraisa.